Snow feathered across the Denver tarmac as Imani Walker stepped into the first-class cabin with her daughter cradled close. The hum of the jet bridge folding into a low, steady hush. The late autumn light was thin and silver. She found her seat along the window, slipped a soft blanket over baby Aria's legs, and set a paper cup of coffee onto the tray table. The cup was still warm. Between her fingers lay a membership card and a boarding pass. Edges neat, names clear. The kind of simple proof that should have needed no performance. Around her, the rhythm of travel moved in familiar ways. The crisp click of overhead bins, a polite "excuse me" as a passenger passed. The clean scent of de-iced air following people in from the jet bridge. The setting was ordinary on its face. Denver International Airport, Concourse B, Gate B27, the first weekend after Thanksgiving. The door of the aircraft remained open to the bridge, and with it came the sense of a threshold not yet crossed a pause before commitment, the way a story holds its breath before a page turn. Imani had flown this corridor many times. She knew the sweetness of a quiet taxi, the way the front range fell away beneath the wing, the soft dose that sometimes found her when the seatbelt sign chimed to life. Today, with Aria's cheek warm against her shoulder, she asked only for a calm flight and the small dignity of a seat she had properly earned. A uniformed attendant approached from the galley, the kind of quick, assured stride that suggested a list already prioritized in her head. Whitney Clark wore a senior's pin and the expression of someone who expected compliance before conversation. She paused at Imani's row, glanced at the boarding pass, then back to Imani with a professional smile that hovered just shy of welcome. "Good afternoon, ma'am. May I see your credentials again?" Imani offered the boarding pass and the membership card without commentary. Politeness served her well in rooms where her presence was quietly measured. Whitney studied the items, thumb pressed to the emboss, eyes moving, face unreadable. "Thank you," Whitney said. "And how did you come to be seated in this section today?" The phrasing held a small weight. Imani kept her voice even. She summarized the reservation and the status attached to her account, mentioned the confirmed seat assignment, and lifted her free hand in a small, open gesture toward the pass that already said as much. Aria roused with a soft sigh. Imani swayed a fraction to soothe her, the motion practiced and instinctive. From across the aisle, a woman in a pearl necklace, Evelyn Grant, watched with the concerned interest some travelers reserve for other people's boarding issues. She leaned toward a companion and murmured something about rules being rules. It was not unkind, not precisely. It simply carried the confidence of someone sure of her place in line. A few rows behind, a college-age passenger, Noah Ramirez, angled his phone screen in a way that suggested habit rather than intent. The camera dark for now, his expression curious. Whitney handed the pass back, smile unchanged. "Sit tight, please. I will need to verify a few details with the purser." The attendant's tone had the neutrality of a weather report, and yet a chill threaded through the row as she moved away. Imani set the pass on the armrest, checked Aria's blanket, and touched the coffee lid, registering that it was still holding warmth. She thought briefly of the boarding time printed earlier at the gate, of the small precision by which an afternoon becomes a record, the way a minute stamped in ink can later anchor a conversation to fact. She was not anxious, she refused that word, but something in her chest tightened and named itself vigilance. Outside, the snow fell in lighter strokes, more suggestion than weather. A ground agent stepped into the doorway and consulted a tablet with a flight attendant. Overhead, the bins thumb closed. A polite announcement asked people to clear the aisle. Somewhere aft, a child laughed at a joke told too softly to reach this far. Imani breathed with Aria, matching the baby's tempo, letting the rhythm settle. Whitney returned with another attendant in the lower rank, the pair aligning at the row as if their presence were a script performed many times before. Whitney's smile remained, but the light in it had cooled. "Ma'am, there appears to be an inconsistency with your placement in this cabin. For safety and service integrity, we may need to relocate you." But Imani felt the baby's weight shift, a small stretch under the blanket. She adjusted her hold and kept her words plain. She explained again that there was no inconsistency, that the seat was confirmed, that the membership information matched the reservation. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She merely represented the facts that had already justified her presence where she Saturday. Evelyn's pearls caught the light as she turned to look again. The glance was not the question so much as a verdict, waiting for enforcement. Noah's phone stayed low, screen swiped to a messenger app. His thumb hovered over the camera icon, then withdrew. He watched the attendants instead, perhaps measuring the moment when the story becomes something people will want to witness in real time. Whitney's colleague shifted, uncomfortable, then stepped aside as if to signal the decision belonged elsewhere. There was a subtle rearrangement of bodies in the aisle, the choreography of crew in consultation, passengers pausing a conversation, a hush near the doorway as another uniform appeared with a clipboard held tight to chest. Imani felt the urge to apologize for existing in the center of a process not of her own making. She refused to do so. She rocked Aria and smiled at no one in particular. a gentle refusal to mirror anyone's impatience. The cabin around her had the human texture of travel in a busy season. A couple speaking softly about a wedding in the city by the bay, a man easing a guitar case into the last inch of space above his row, the quiet patience of a teenager tracing a finger along the window's frosted edge. The familiar manners of American emotion were all present here. The automatic thank you as someone stood to let someone else slide past. The shared annoyance with the overhead bin that resisted closing. The small humor of a seat pocket that always seemed to collapse at the wrong moment. In this warmth of ordinary courtesy, the colder current ran. The fact that Imani's claim plain and properly documented seemed to require proof beyond the proof in her hand. Whitney returned a third time, alone now, posture composed into authority. Her smile had vanished. In its place stood the crisp tone of policy. "Ma'am," she said, "if we are unable to resolve this with your cooperation, we will ask you to move out of this section for the safety of service. If you decline, we will have to ask you to leave the aircraft." Imani heard only the pieces that mattered. She did not squeeze tighter around her daughter. She did not stiffen. She let her breath arrive the way breath always arrives, on time and sufficient. She asked, in the same even voice, what precisely required her to abandon a seat she held by right. She asked what safety issue had been identified today that was absent when she boarded. She asked whether the attendant's concern was with process or with her. Whitney blinked and did not answer the last question. "Stay seated for now," she said. "I will be back." She left again, the aisle refilled with minor motions. A coat being shrugged off, a magazine settled, a bag zipped. The captain's voice had not yet risen from the flight deck. The door remained unsealed. The moments gathered like snowflakes on the sill, delicate by themselves, noticeable in the aggregate. Imani balanced the coffee cup in her palm and felt again the soft heat radiating into her skin. Evidence, she thought, often arrives in the quietest ways. Noah's gaze flicked to her face and away. He seemed to be working through his own calculation, the one that decides if a phone becomes a witness or stays a personal device. He glanced toward the galley, toward the doorway, toward the place where authority often materializes in a hat and a calm voice. A ground agent glanced up the aisle, then stepped back as someone in the captain's uniform reached the threshold. The attendant at the forward jump seat straightened subtly, as if the room had acquired a new center of gravity. The mood shifted in that gentle way a cabin knows before an announcement. People quieting, posture attentive, a stray laugh tapering into expectant silence. Imani adjusted Arya's blanket again, whispering comfort into the baby's hair. She did not preempt the next conversation. She did not rehearse rebuttals in her head. She sat with the facts she carried and the presence she refused to surrender. When she lifted her eyes, she saw motion at the front of the cabin and knew that the next chapter of this afternoon had arrived, whether or not she had been invited to write it. The cabin door eased on its hinges as Richard Hale appeared at the head of the aisle. Cold air spilled in from the jet bridge just as the soft clicks of seatbelts snapped through the quiet. Captain Richard Hale stood at the front of the aisle with the composed bearing of someone who has said the same words in many cabins across many seasons. The first-class compartment quieted on its own, the way a room quiets when it knows authority has entered it. He listened to Whitney Clark's low summary, eyes steady, then addressed Imani Walker with the practiced clarity of airline service. He thanked her for her patience. He explained that the operation needed to depart on time for the sake of connections and runway flow. He said there appeared to be an inconsistency with her placement in the cabin. His tone remained courteous, each sentence tidy as a checklist item, yet the meaning under the words was unmistakable. If the matter could not be resolved with her cooperation, they would ask her to move, and if she declined, they would have to ask her to deplane. Imani felt the familiar weight of her daughter settle against her forearm. She adjusted the small blanket, checked that Arya's breathing stayed slow and easy, and met the captain's gaze without raising her voice. She said she understood the need to keep the flight on schedule. She also said the seat was properly assigned and paid for, that her membership status matched the record, that the boarding time printed at the gate aligned with her presence in the seat now. She did not present these points as a performance. They were facts arranged as simply as a paper cup of coffee on her tray table, still holding a comfortable warmth. Across the aisle, Evelyn Grant's pearls gave a soft shine as she watched. Mouth set in an expression that looked like sympathy but sounded like rules are rule. A few rows back, Noah Ramirez lifted his phone and opened the camera. The lens stayed at chest height, not yet raised. The screen brightness turned down as if he were testing where this moment belonged. In memory or in the recording other people might need to see. Whitney stepped in a half pace closer to the armrest, her voice careful and formal. She said the airline always retained the right to refuse service for safety and service integrity. She said the crew made those judgments to protect all passengers. Imani asked what safety condition had been identified this afternoon that was not present when she boarded. Whitney's expression did not change. She said she would confer with the captain and the purser one more time. The door to the jet bridge remained open. Winter air moved through the threshold in a faint ribbon that smelled of de-icing fluid and cold iron. In the galley, A ground agent scrolled a tablet and nodded to a quiet question from another flight attendant. The season after Thanksgiving always brought a certain tautness to the work, a wish to keep the day on the rails. Richard returned, and with him came the shape of a process that had been carried out in many cabins before. He said, in the same calm cadence, that they would initiate a voluntary deplaning procedure unless the situation could be resolved immediately. He asked Imani to consider moving to a different section to avoid delay. The request was framed as courtesy. The consequence, should she decline, was presented as necessity. Imani held his eyes, not in challenge, but in clarity. She explained once more that the record would confirm her seat and status, and she asked that they check the log instead of her patience. There was no anger in her voice. There was only the quiet insistence of a person asking to be respected by the same process extended to others. A chime sounded softly through the speakers, and even an anonymous voice announced that, for the sake of schedule and safety, a timeline would begin. Passengers were asked to remain seated while the crew addressed a situation in the forward cabin. The language was sterile, like a hospital note, but the cabin understood. In Imani's role, the air seemed to thin, the way air does before a summer storm. Even though the weather outside was winter, Whitney returned and spoke the words that set the tone for everything that followed. The airline would begin the countdown, and if the matter was not resolved within 1 minute, the customer would be asked to deplane. The phrasing wore a polite suit. Its shoes were made of steel. Imani rocked Arya in the small rhythm that mothers have always used to steady babies and themselves. She asked that the boarding log be checked now, that the membership record be verified now, that the policy invoked be named, not implied. Whitney repeated the line about safety and integrity. Imani said she respected safety and integrity. She also respected accuracy. A few seats away, a man settled a guitar case more firmly into the overhead, then sat with his hands folded, eyes on the floor, as if not looking might soften the sound of what was being said. Evelyn cleared her throat and said something about how the cabin had to be kept orderly. Noah's finger hovered above the icon that would send his camera feed out to anyone who cared to watch it. He glanced at Imani and then at the captain, an instinctive search for permission from both. The anonymous voice returned, softer, counting down in the same calm register that once announced a weather delay and now measured the possibility of removing a mother holding a child. The seconds did not shout. They did not have to. Each one took up a chair all its own. The door to the jet bridge stayed ajar. The world on the other side remained full of movement. Airport staff in bright vests, a family hustling past with rolling bags, a whisper of cold, then warm, then cold again as the air shifted. Somewhere in the back, a toddler gave a short howl and was soothed by a quiet promise that the plane would be in the sky soon. The first-class cabin held its breath. Imani let hers come and go in an even tide. Richard shifted a few inches, as if the timing of the procedure rested not only in the script, but in his posture. He spoke into the handset and asked that airport security be available at the door as a precaution. He thanked everyone for their patience. He said again that safety was paramount. The words were true in their own context. They also said, for Imani, inside a story older than this airplane and this gate. A story in which certain people were asked to prove what others were allowed to assume. She remembered the boarding time printed earlier in a small, irritated thought from a stranger in line who had said something about first class being crowded these days. She remembered the way Whitney's questions had been framed as courtesies and felt as examinations. She kissed Arya's forehead and decided, once more, to remain exactly as composed as she was. Noah lifted his phone to shoulder height, the camera now recording. He did not narrate. He kept the frame steady and wide, showing faces and bodies only in the respectful shapes of strangers who had not consented to be the center of a story. Evelyn looked at him and then looked away, a flicker of discomfort crossing her features as if she recognized herself in the posture of someone who believes order is always on her side. In the galley, a flight attendant closed a drawer and straightened a stack of napkins that did not need straightening. The rituals of order hold people together when the room is unsure what else to do. The announcement voice explained. In that same careful tone, that voluntary deplaning would be requested at the end of the countdown. It said the procedure was for the safety and comfort of all. The language avoided blame and landed on inevitability. Whitney stood a step behind the captain now, hands clasped, chin lifted a fraction, her expression somewhere between stern and blank. The expression of someone doing a job in which feeling is not a tool. Imani asked, again, if the record had been checked. The answer did not arrive. Arya fussed, then quieted, when Imani touched the soft spot near her temple and began a tiny hum only the baby could hear. Two figures appeared in the doorway of the aircraft, framed by the jet bridge light. Laura Kim and Miguel Ortiz, airport security officers in navy jackets, and the weary patience of people who know that much of their work is listening before acting. They did not enter. They stood at the threshold with professional stillness, waiting for a signal that might call them forward or release them back to their rounds. Richard acknowledged them with a nod, then spoke softly to Whitney, and Whitney spoke softly to the nearest attendant, and the message moved down the invisible wires that always exist inside crews that work together often. The procedure ticked on. Imani considered the meaning of cooperation. She considered the gap between what is asked and what is expected, between the face of policy and the hand that uses it. She breathed, she looked at the coffee cup on her tray, and thought about the small and ordinary way heat fades. She thought about records and logs, and the plain power of an accurate time stamped by an indifferent system. She did not think about what she would say if a hand reached toward her arm. She chose not to live in a future she did not owe the room. She chose to remain here, in this minute, in this seat, with her daughter, and with the truth of her ticket. The announcement voice resumed, the soft instrument of an official measure. It said the procedure would conclude soon. It asked for continued patience. The syllables were smooth, and beneath them everyone heard the roughness of a choice being pressed. Whitney glanced toward the door again, toward Laura and Miguel, then back to Imani. Her mouth opened, then closed. She seemed to be waiting for the clock to do what she had not been able to do with an argument. Imani's phone vibrated in her palm, a small pulse against her skin like a heartbeat she could hold. She looked at the caller's name, waited for half a breath, and then decided to call back. The cabin door remained open. The countdown had 30 seconds. Imani pressed the call button and, when Whitney appeared again at the aisle, asked in a steady voice that the phone be placed on speaker so the conversation could be heard clearly. She did not raise the hand that held her phone. She did not bargain or plead. She stated, as plainly as a boarding announcement, that she wished to request verification of records, the exact boarding time printed at the gate, the validity of her first-class ticket, and the membership status that matched her reservation. Outside the open door, a tug idled in a low diesel hum. The air slipping in from the jet bridge tasted like metal and snow. Imani rested her cup in her palm and felt the lingering warmth, its ordinary heat, a small clock of its own, then looked at Whitney with the kind of patience that asked to be met rather than tested. Whitney hesitated, then nodded as if conceding a procedural point. She retrieved a cabin phone from the forward galley, glanced toward Captain Richard Hale, and returned with the quiet choreography of someone who preferred decisions to be invisible. The handset's cord made a small loop against the bulkhead. Imani's voice, still even, carried the request a second time. Speakerphone, please. For accuracy. For all to hear. Whitney exchanged a glance with the captain and the purser, then pressed a key. The cabin speakers clicked alive with a thin hiss. Imani introduced herself, her seat, and the nature of her request for verification. She spoke without titles or credentials. The record would be enough. A beat later, a man's voice answered calm, cultured, and so sure of his footing that it needed no raised volume. He identified himself by first and last name only, asked that the line remain on speaker, and requested that any countdown or removal procedure be paused while records were checked. He did not rush. He did not scold. He asked, with perfect clarity, for a simple thing: accuracy before action. He said that a colleague in legal would join momentarily to read the relevant logs. Whitney's posture changed by a degree difficult to measure. Shoulders half a notch higher, chin set. Richard's eyes were watchful in a way that suggested both experience and calculation. Laura Kim and Miguel Ortiz, the security officers at the door, remained where they were, posture neutral, listening as professionals do when they know that listening is part of the work. The galley light washed the forward aisle in a soft square. Noah Ramirez lowered his phone a fraction, angling it toward the seatback card rather than anyone's face, the frame wide and discreet. He did not narrate. The first-class cabin steadied itself around the sound of the caller's voice, around Imani's steadiness, around the quiet part of air travel, in which strangers decide together how a day will proceed. A few rows back, a business traveler closed his laptop as if to make room for attention. Across the aisle, Evelyn Grant folded her hands on her purse, pearls cool against her neck. Her eyes moved not like a judge's now, but like a neighbor's. There is a way a room breathes when certainty is replaced by care. The man on the line asked that 3 items be read aloud for the cabin: the boarding time, the ticket validation for the first-class seat, and any recordings made by the interphone or other internal systems during the earlier interaction at the row. A second voice joined measured, precise, and identified himself as counsel for the airline. He said he was pulling the logs. He asked for the flight number and gate. The purser answered. He asked for the seat assignment. Imani answered. He asked whether the aircraft door was still open. Richard confirmed that it was. Counsel requested 1 minute to gather entries from the gate scanner and the cabin interphone. Imani smoothed the blanket over Aria's legs. The baby's breath puffed and settled. Her small fist tightened and then released against the cotton. The cup in Imani's hand no longer radiated the warmth it had a short while earlier, yet it retained a trace of heat at the seam where the lid met the rim. She thought of clocks that never argue, a gate scanner stamping a time in quiet ink, the thermal patience of a drink, the sound of a speaker hiss before a voice arrives. She kept her eyes on Whitney's face, not to challenge, only to anchor the moment to a human being who would hear what came next. Counsel returned to the line. His diction could have been set to a metronome. He read the boarding time first, naming the hour and minute in words, and confirmed that the stamp matched the manifest for Imani Walker in the first-class seat. He read that ticket validation for the seat was complete and that the record included a membership status appropriate to the cabin. He paused, then said he would play a brief segment transcribed from an internal recording made when a call button was active at the row. He quoted a sentence about placement in this cabin and another sentence about cooperation. He did not editorialize. He read and let the reading do its work. The cabin held still in the way a church holds still when a bell is speaking. Whitney's expression did not change, except perhaps at the corners of the mouth. Richard kept his gaze trained forward, but his hands were not quite as motionless as his face. Laura Kim shifted her weight from one foot to the other as if to keep circulation calm, and Miguel Ortiz's eyes went from the open door to the aisle and back, an officer's quiet scan. Someone in the back row cleared a throat and then regretted the small human noise. Evelyn's hands opened and closed atop her purse, her knuckles pale, then less pale, as if her body were admitting something her mouth had not yet formed into words. Imani asked, as respectfully as before, that the countdown be paused now, that verification had begun. She asked that any enforcement be suspended while counsel finished the reading. She asked that the policy cited be named clearly on the record, along with the evidence used to apply it. Winnie started to say something about safety and integrity. The man on the phone thanked her for her diligence and repeated, in a tone that brooked no confusion, that decisions informed by recordings and logs were always preferable to decisions made without them. He then asked for the handset to be placed on cabin speaker if it was not already. Whitney glanced at Richard. The handset was already on speaker. There was nowhere else for the words to go but into the room where they were most needed. The galley stacked cups with a gentle clack of plastic on plastic. A faint scent of brewed coffee drifted forward. Passengers adjusted seatbelts that did not need adjusting. The rituals of travel made themselves small to allow the substance of the moment to be large. Noah held his phone low enough that it caught only shoes and carpet and the edge of a seatback car that reminded people to fasten belts when seated. He thought, without saying it, that civility is not a decoration in moments like this. It is a lifeline. Counsel asked permission to summarize what had been read so far and to outline the remaining steps. Confirmation of boarding time complete. Confirmation of ticket validation complete. Partial transcript of interphone interaction complete, and the request that the crew cite the specific safety condition necessitating relocation or removal. He framed the summary with courtesy. He ended it with a sentence that sounded like a beam laid across a span. Accuracy protects everyone. Richard swallowed the reply and let the words rest. Whitney's hands folded more tightly at her waist. Imani breathed in, then out, and said she appreciated the verification. Her words were simple and unadorned, the way truth prefers. She said she would remain seated with her child while the procedure of checking continued. She asked that the officers at the door be thanked for their patience. Laura King and Miguel Ortiz nodded. Once the nod of people who are comfortable being present without being theatrical. The open door letting another ribbon of cold air and the faint sound of rolling bags in the concourse. For a moment, the aircraft felt like a porch between a storm and a hearth. The man on the phone spoke again, voice steady as a level. He said, the next step will be to read 3 points to the cabin, so that all parties share the same foundation. The boarding time as recorded, the validation of the ticket for the first-class seat, and the content of the internal recording relevant to the interaction. He said that after those 3 points were read, a recommendation would follow. He did not name the recommendation. He did not need to yet. What mattered was the order of operations. Facts first, then decision. Noah's camera lens darkened as he lowered the phone completely, choosing to witness with his own eyes. Evelyn's gaze moved to Imani and stayed there. Something in her posture softened, the way a tightened ribbon loosens when a knot is untied. In the rear, a teenager closed his eyes as if to will the airplane into calmer air. Whitney inhaled and held a breath, then released it with a small, audible resolve. Richard looked at the handset as if it were a mirror and he were deciding what kind of face to bring into it. Please pause all enforcement measures for 2 minutes. The voice on the line was firm. Passengers looked up. Richard and Whitney exchanged a glance. The caller's true identity had not yet been revealed. The speaker hiss settled into a hush that felt almost physical, a quiet that let words land not as noise but as weight. Imani held her phone steady on her thigh and, with the same calm she had brought to every step of this day, asked that the verification proceed in full. The boarding time that was printed at the gate, the validation of her first-class ticket, and the membership status tied to her reservation. The forward galley light softened the aisle to a pale square. The open door to the jet bridge fed the cabin a thin ribbon of cold that smelled faintly of snow and de-icing fluid. Whitney Clark signaled to the purser. Captain Richard Hale stood near the threshold, a steel figure inside a ritual he had performed in other rooms on other days. Laura Kim and Miguel Ortiz, patient at the doorway, watched with the quiet attention of professionals who understand that listening is part of keeping a place safe. A paper cup on Imani's tray held a low, residual warmth, a tiny clock that whispered how little time had passed since she boarded. Evelyn Grant folded her hands over her purse, pearls cool against her neck. Noah Ramirez lowered his camera angle to show carpet and shoes more than faces, the lens recording a room that was beginning to behave like a room again. The voice on the line confident without being loud, asked that the countdown be paused while records were read. He requested, in the same measured tone one might use to explain a standard safety briefing, that accuracy come before action. Another voice joined, introducing himself as legal counsel for the airline. He asked for the flight number and the gate, for the seat and the boarding door status, and then said he would return within 1 minute to read 3 items into the room. Imani kept her breathing even and matched it unconsciously to the rise and fall of baby Aria's small chest. She looked, not challengingly but directly, at Whitney's face. The attendant's features were careful and set a mask that wanted to be mistaken for neutrality. Richard's hands, by contrast, were not quite as still as his expression. One thumb moved over the other in a slow, thoughtful loop. Counsel returned and read the boarding time in words, confirming that the stamp matched Imani Walker's name and assignment in the first-class cabin. He continued with the validation of the ticket, noting that the record showed a completed transaction appropriate to the seat. He then summarized a short segment transcribed from an internal corridor of audio, a call button interaction that included phrasing about placement in this cabin and cooperation. He did not interpret the segment. He did not raise his voice. He used the language the system had captured and let the room hear what the system had heard. Whitney lifted her chin by a narrow degree. Richard's eyes moved for a heartbeat toward the handset speaker and then back to the doorway. Evelyn's fingers loosened on her purse in a small, human concession to the idea that facts, once spoken plainly, changed the air. Imani asked, again with courtesy, that any enforcement be held while the reading concluded. She asked that any policy being applied be named on the record. Whitney answered in the lexicon of service: safety, integrity, discretion. The man on the phone thanked her for vigilance and reminded the cabin, gently but unmistakably, that decisions anchored in logs and recordings protect everyone, crew and passengers alike. He asked that the handset remain on speaker. He repeated, without impatience, that accuracy was the most respectful form of speed. The galley offered the soft clack of stacked cups and the compassionate smell of fresh coffee. A business traveler in row 2 closed his laptop, as if to underwrite the idea that attention is a kind of participation. Laura Kim shifted half a step forward, not to intrude but to be seen by the crew. In a voice tuned for calm, she suggested that the voluntary deplaning countdown remain paused while counsel completed the review. Miguel Ortiz nodded once, a practical punctuation mark. The door stayed open. The jet bridge continued to breathe its code into the cabin. In the rear, a child laughed at a whispered joke. The sound lifted and settled like a bird considering a branch. The moment held, the room chose patience. The first voice returned, measured as before. He thanked the crew for pausing enforcement. He offered, in a tone that built a bridge rather than a wall, a brief summary. The boarding time and the ticket validation aligned with the passenger's claim. The internal audio reflected language that, at minimum, merited a second look at the decision to relocate or remove. Then his diction shifted by a degree of change, not of volume but of authority, made explicit. He stated his name again, and this time he placed it inside the title. Chief Executive of Skybridge Airways. He added, without drama, that because he had a personal relationship with the passenger in question, all remedies would be routed through counsel and an independent officer to ensure fairness. The cabin absorbed the disclosure in the particular silence reserved for clarity. Noah's eyes widened over the edge of his phone. Evelyn's mouth parted and then closed, as if a thought had found its form and was learning how to stand in it. Imani knew the voice beyond the title. She knew it the way a song lives in the body of someone who has heard it in kitchens and cars and quiet rooms at the end of heavy days. She kept that knowledge to herself. What mattered here was not their story, but the principle being asserted at a human scale, that a process owed to everyone would be applied to her as well, in public, with care. Counsel took the line again. He recommended, formally, that any relocation or removal be suspended, that the captain and the senior flight attendant be relieved of active duty for this segment, pending an independent review, and that a formal apology be extended to the customer in the cabin where the harm had occurred. He named the review as independent twice, and the word sat down in the aisle like a chair. Richard inhaled to speak, then let the breath go. Whitney's hands tightened, then released. The purser's gaze moved gently between them, measuring not blame but next steps. Laura stood very still, waiting for someone with stripes to decide if dignity would be treated as a resource or a cost. Miguel Ortiz kept his face neutral and his eyes soft, the way an officer does when presence is enough. Imani stroked Aria's hair with the faintest touch. The baby sighed and pressed her face against her mother's shoulder. a small act of trust that filled the row. Richard spoke first, voice low and careful. He acknowledged the recommendation. He said he would comply. Whitney swallowed and nodded. Counsel asked that the apology be read now, in plain language, with respect. Richard hesitated. The purser stepped forward, a kindness disguised as procedure, and offered to read the words. The statement was brief. It acknowledged that the customer's documentation aligned with the records. It acknowledged that the language used in the earlier interaction fell short of the standard owed in this cabin and any cabin. It apologized to Miss Walker. It promised that an independent review would begin immediately and that the crew involved would be relieved from duty for this segment while that review proceeded. The speech did not strain for poetry. It did a simpler, harder thing. It named what had happened and asked forgiveness in a voice that belonged to the company and the people in the room. Imani listened without nodding, as if she were keeping the words company so they would not have to walk to her alone. She did not add anything. She did not subtract. She received the apology the way one receives a glass of water in a dry place, with gratitude for the substance and without complaint about the cup. Evelyn turned to her and whispered that she was sorry. The sentence was small and unadorned and arrived as a gift nonetheless. Noah kept his phone steady but dropped the frame lower, away from faces. He understood instinctively that not every sincere apology needs to be captured to be real. Counsel's voice returned, outlining the immediate operational steps in the same clean lines he had used for the evidence. A relief captain would be called to the jet bridge. The senior flight attendant would be relieved. The current crew would cede the segment to colleagues. The door would remain open until the changeover was complete. The schedule would be adjusted with the cooperation of ground control. An incident report would be filed both internally and with the appropriate oversight body. The customer would be offered any small comforts available in the cabin, including quiet and privacy. He concluded by thanking the officers at the door for their patience and the passengers for their courtesy. He did not thank them for their silence. He did not ask for it. He allowed the room to keep its voice, now resting on solid ground. Richard acknowledged the plan. Winnie stepped back toward the jump seat, eyes focused on the middle distance of professionalism. The purser arranged a blanket and a cup of warm water on Imani's tray with a quiet, "If this helps, please take it." Laura Kim made a brief notation on the pad and conferred in a whisper with Miguel Ortiz, a notation that meant the presence at the door would remain calm and minimal. The galley door closed with a soft seal. Somewhere aft, someone murmured a prayer that was not a sermon, only a hand placed gently on a moment. The call remained open as a line of respect rather than authority. The voice, identified as chief executive, thanked the cabin for pausing and said he would step back to allow operations to proceed. He did not claim victory. He did not perform virtue. He returned, as he had begun, to accuracy, to the primacy of facts when people's dignity sits in the balance. He wished everyone a safe journey and yielded the channel to counsel. Imani exhaled through her nose and felt the breath leave her shoulders. She kissed the crown of Arya's head. She looked out at the jet bridge and saw, in the pale winter light, the shape of a new uniform approaching with brisk, contained purpose. The room shifted again, not with drama, but with competence reasserting itself. People resumed being people. A cough swallowed with a sip of water, a zipper eased closed, a whispered promise that they would land soon and there would be breakfast in the city by the bay. The relief captain is on the way. The flight will continue in accordance with regulations. Noah lowered his phone, but his eyes still shone as if waiting for an even bigger announcement. The relief captain stepped into the cabin with an ease that reset the room's posture without scolding it. He greeted the front row, thanked everyone for their patience, and introduced himself by name and role in a tone that made order feel like a form of care. He asked the purser to complete the necessary paperwork and confirmed, with a glance to the doorway, that security would remain available until the changeover was complete and the door sealed. He did not repeat what had already been said on the speaker. He simply took the weight of the day and held it with steady hands, as if steadiness were part of the aircraft's equipment. Imani balanced the paper cup against her palm and felt what little warmth remained, the faintest echo of the time before the room had learned too much about itself. Arya had settled, her breath soft, and even under the small blanket. The purser set a fresh cup of warm water on the tray with a low, "If this helps, please take it," and a nod that said the words were not scripted, even if the job was. Crew members moved with the quiet choreography of people returning a space to neutral. They quietly swapped jump seats, signed forms, and checked the cabin log. At the door, Laura Kim took notes in a compact hand. Miguel Ortiz watched the flow of the aisle with the patience of a crossing guard who knows that 2 inches of courtesy can prevent 2 hours of trouble. The handset line had already closed, but its afterglow seemed to linger in the way people carried their shoulders. Daniel Brooks, having finished the reading that had anchored the room to facts, appeared once more at the threshold with a calm word for the relief captain. The record reflected validation of boarding and seat. The interim relief of the previous captain and senior attendant was noted. The independent review would begin immediately through established channels. A brief operational summary would be sent to the cabin crew so that no one would be asked to guess at procedure. He thanked Laura and Miguel for their restraint and told the relief captain that the door could remain open until the crew swap was complete. The purser returned to the public address with a voice tuned a shade softer than standard briefing. She offered a formal apology to Miss Walker, acknowledged the earlier language as falling short of the cabin standard, and explained without rancor that the company would conduct an independent review with findings to follow. She asked all passengers to be kind with one another as the flight resumed preparation. The words landed in the quiet, the way flurries land on an empty sidewalk. Small, separate, and together enough to cover the ground. Imani received the apology without ceremony. She did not perform forgiveness. She allowed it. Her gaze took in Evelyn Grant across the aisle, those familiar pearls catching the cabin light, and found not a judge now, but a neighbor. Evelyn leaned slightly toward the aisle, and, in a voice meant for one person rather than many, said she was sorry for what she had said and for what she had assumed. The sentence was not long, but it arrived straight. Imani nodded once, an acknowledgement that did not erase the wound and did not refuse the bandage. A few rows back, Noah Ramirez lowered his phone to his lap. He had been recording the room, not the faces. And now he stopped, as if the story had changed genres from confrontation to repair and did not need commentary to keep its shape. The relief captain invited the purser to begin normal procedures. He confirmed with ground that the swap had been recorded. He asked security to remain within sight until the door was closed, then thanked them for standing by without becoming the center of the picture. Laura and Miguel accepted the thanks in the quiet way professionals do. They spoke briefly to one another and to the purser about filing their independent report, not as witnesses for one side, but as witnesses for the truth of the process. Their language was unadorned and exact. Times, places, speakers, sequence. The kind of accuracy that feels like dignity when you are the one it protects. Around them, the ordinary manners of American travel reasserted themselves. A passenger who had been gripping an armrest in row 2 exhaled and asked, very softly, whether anyone would like a peppermint. Someone toward the back laughed once at nothing in particular and then apologized to the air. A flight attendant knelt to retrieve a fallen boarding card and handed it back with a "you're all set" that sounded like a benediction. The smell of brewed coffee drifted forward again. And for a moment, the cabin was less a container of strangers and more a temporary neighborhood where people remembered how to be polite. The purser began the safety demonstration with a tone that asked for attention rather than demanded it. The relief captain listened along as if he were hearing it for the first time. He checked the time with ground and then, with the same measured cadence that had opened his presence in the room, explained the next steps. Paperwork, cross-check, door, and pushback. He did not rush the syllables. He did not skim them. He let the process be heard as a series of promises. We will do this, then we will do this, then we will go. Imani traced a fingertip along the seam of the couplet and found the last bit of heat where plastic met cardboard. Arya's breath deepened, the small animal trust of babies who sleep wherever their caretakers are steady. When the demonstration concluded, the relief captain made a second announcement, brief and clear. After landing, the airline would share a statement regarding new procedures intended to prevent incidents like today's from recurring. It would include immediate steps and longer-term training, along with a channel for passengers and employees to report concerns directly. He did not name the channel yet. He did not read a bullet list. He simply said there would be a public outline in the morning, and he said it in a way that made a promise feel like a plan. The cabin took the news in a low, collective murmur that sounded like approval and relief built from equal parts. This was the chapter in which the room remembered that repair is work. A flight attendant returned to Imani's row with a soft blanket folded over her arm and a small bottle of water. She asked quietly, privately, whether Miss Walker would prefer a quieter corner of the cabin while the plane taxied. Imani declined and thanked her. She was content to remain where she was, not as a point proved, but as a life continued. She brushed a thumb along Arya's hair and felt, with gratitude rather than triumph, that the child's body had learned to trust the world again, at least for now. The aisle swelled with small acts of decency. A man yielded his armrest without being asked. A woman stepped aside to let a late passenger reach her seat and added a gentle "take your time" that diffused a knot of embarrassment. The purser quietly reminded the front row that devices should be in airplane mode. Noah complied and then tucked his phone into a side pocket, choosing to be present as a person instead of present as a lens. He looked at Imani and gave a small nod that asked for nothing and promised nothing and somehow offered company. At the doorway, Laura Kim finished her notes and spoke softly with Miguel about next steps. They would file their report before the aircraft left the ground so that the record would not depend on the memory of a long day. They would include the observable facts, the sequence of announcements, the moment at which the countdown paused, the names of the crew present, and the fact that a formal apology had been made aloud in the cabin. They did not discuss opinions, they did not need to. Their work was to make a line of clean words from the door to the truth. The purser secured the galley. The last ground agent leaned in to confirm that the paperwork had cleared. The relief captain let a breath go, not of fatigue, but of readiness. He checked with the tower, checked with the crew, and then checked with the cabin one last time. The door was armed, the cross-check was complete. The threshold that had stayed open while the room learned to look at itself was ready to close. For a heartbeat, everything in the forward cabin felt suspended, like a help note at the end of a hymn. Imani closed her eyes long enough to hear the room without looking at it. She heard the staccato of buckles, the soft burr of a seatback pocket being padded into submission, the friendly murmur of a flight attendant who could make a safety instruction sound like a favor. She heard Evelyn's breath steady into a normal rhythm. She heard the quiet contentment of a community reassembled from awkward parts. She opened her eyes to the aisle and found herself in a room that had, in the space of an hour and some careful words, become less interested in hierarchy and more interested in decency. The overhead speaker chimed. The relief captain's voice returned, warm and contained. He thanked everyone again. He said they would begin to taxi. He reminded passengers that announcements would be brief and necessary. He wished them a safe journey and, with a small smile audible in his tone, promised that the sunrise over the city by the bay could make even a tired morning beautiful. Imani looked through the small gap between shades and saw the county's winter light settle over wing and concrete. The way light can soften hard angles when given permission. She pressed a kiss to the crown of her daughter's head and felt the tiny shiver that babies give when their sleep acknowledges a kindness. She did not think about the review to come in great detail. She did not rehearse outcomes. She accepted, for this moment, a simple truth, that being treated correctly in public, after being treated incorrectly in public, was its own kind of repair, and that she would keep asking for accuracy until accuracy became a habit rather than an intervention. The captain gave one last nod toward the officers at the door. Laura and Miguel stepped back from the threshold as the jet bridge eased away. Their work did not require applause. The shift of air and the return to ordinary duties were thanks enough. The purser stowed the last paperwork folder, and the flight attendant took a slow breath before fastening her own harness at the jump seat. People turned their faces forward, a small, united act. The cabin lights dimmed. The aircraft rolled toward the runway. Imani looked at her sleeping child and exhaled, but she wondered, how specific will the new procedure be? Morning at the San Francisco arrivals hall came with a soft bustle of luggage wheels and the glow of overhead boards, and the news traveled ahead of voices the way light arrives before heat. Skybridge had posted a notice on every nearby screen announcing that the pier standard would begin, with immediate steps in place and further training to follow in phases. Imani stood beneath the monitor, Arya drowsy against her shoulder, and read the words twice, not to doubt them but to let them take their shape in her day. The notice was written plainly, without the dressed-up language that tries to make policy feel like applause. It said there would be a public outline today, a training window measured in weeks rather than seasons, and a way for passengers and employees to speak directly to the people in charge without their concerns being sent back to the same desk that caused the trouble. Around her, other travelers paused in that unplanned choreography of airport's one person reading aloud for another, a pair of hands pointing to the same line as if to keep it from drifting away. The promise from the flight and announcement after landing had found its morning. The short statement led to a small press gathering by the windows near baggage claim, the kind that borrows a corner of public space and turns it into a listening room. Malcolm Pierce stood in a modest half-circle of microphones and thanked everyone for their patience. He did not rehearse the cabin moment from Denver. He did not make the apology a spectacle. He kept to what the day required. Daniel Brooks, the company's counsel, took the main microphone long enough to place 4 beams under the new structure. First, mandatory anti-bias training for all customer-facing employees and managers on the timeline that would begin now and be completed within 30 days, with refreshers scheduled on a regular cadence. Second, a direct escalation channel available to customers and employees that would bypass the ordinary chain when the ordinary chain was the problem, staffed by a team that reported to a separate oversight office. Third, transparent monitoring of cabin interactions through systems already in place, governed by privacy rules that protect the dignity of passengers while preserving evidence when dignity is not protected. Fourth, public discipline summaries at the end of each quarter, with names withheld as policy and law require, but with enough detail to prove that consequences are not a rumor. He spoke in sentences short enough to be heard over the rolling of bags and the announcements about carousels. He stressed that immediate items would start today, that training would begin this week and be completed within the 30-day window, and that the escalation portal will go live by the afternoon. Reporters asked questions about the balance between privacy and transparency, about the cost of training, about how a company proves that it is not just posting a billboard over an old road. Daniel answered with the restraint of a person who knows he owes results more than eloquence. He explained that internal recordings will be accessed only in defined circumstances, and that consent rules will be honored. That training will be measured not only by attendance, but by changes in valuations and outcomes. that the portal would be administrated by a small unit chartered to publish anonymized metrics so that the public could see patterns and not just promises. Malcolm stepped forward once to say that policy is only as good as the people who carry it, and that the company would reward those who used authority to keep dignity safe. He took no questions about his private life. He said that his role today was to stand for a standard, not a story. The gathering lasted not much more than a handful of minutes, and ended with a thank you that sounded like someone placing the lid gently on a pot, not like someone slamming a door. Imani moved through arrivals with unhurried patience that follows a long flight done well enough. She lifted Arya into a stroller, adjusted a small hat over tiny ears, and considered the shape of breakfast in a city that always has a place for tired travelers. Outside, a rideshare driver nodded from a curb spot and offered to load the suitcase. He made small talk about the traffic and the wind off the bay, the ordinary music of an American morning. They rode a short distance to a diner not far from the airport, the kind of place where the coffee is endless and the pancakes arrive the size of a hand with room for syrup. The hostess greeted them with a smile that landed exactly as it sounded. A server brought water without being asked, glanced at the stroller, and said they could have the corner booth that was quieter at this hour. The room smelled like toasted bread and orange peel. Someone at the counter read a newspaper, the real kind, not a glowing screen. A cook called an order in a voice that made the pots and pans sound like instruments. The server returned with coffee for Imani and a warm cup of water for the bottle, then asked if she wanted the eggs medium or easy, if she preferred wheat or sourdough, if she wanted fruit instead of hash browns. The questions were ordinary and dignifying. Imani answered in the language of a person being cared for by a stranger who is paid to care and chooses to do the job well. When the food came, she ate the eggs while they were still hot and laughed softly at herself for being grateful for something so simple. She left a tip that matched the service, the quiet, and the kindness on the generous side of the usual 18 to 20%, and felt the small click inside that comes when fairness looks like a number on the receipt. Her phone buzzed with a message from the airline. It thanked her for her patience the previous day and said that a copy of the apology and a summary of the steps announced this morning were attached. It included a link to the escalation portal and a brief outline of how the independent review would proceed. It did not ask her to sign anything. It did not suggest what she ought to feel. It offered an avenue to speak if she wished and promised a follow-up, even if she did not. She forwarded the message to her own email, then saved the attachments with the tidy care of a person who knows that organized facts are their own kind of shelter. Noah Ramirez had posted a modest summary on his channel by then. He did not use anyone's face. He described the shape of the moment without loading it with adjectives. He wrote that the room had bent toward accuracy and that he had learned something about when the camera ought to get out of the way. In the comments, a small chorus of older viewers thanked him for the clear tone. A few said that their children flew often and that they would be paying attention to quarterly summaries. Evelyn Grant, who had gone home and slept poorly, opened the airline site and the portals page and wrote a message with the same neatness that she brought to everything in her life. She apologized not only to Imani, but to the crew whose good work had been pulled off course by a moment that asked more of them than they gave. She did not ask for a reply. She asked for better. Back at the airport, Daniel stood with a small team in a conference room with too much glass and a view of planes taxiing like thoughts becoming decisions. He checked the timestamps on the portal, watched the first few entries arrive, and made sure the automated acknowledgement was as human as code can be. He drafted the language for the quarterly summary with the promise that the first report would not be buried at the end of a busy news week. He called the training vendor to confirm dates and expectations. He sent a note to the union liaison that described the review as a guardrail, not as a trap. He asked for the internal memo to be written in words any employee's parent could read without feeling talked down to. Imani breathed in the diner's easy air and let the night lift off her shoulders. She fed Arya and watched the baby's eyes roll gently towards sleep, safe in a booth, under a warm vent, guarded by nothing more dramatic than ordinary decency. She thought about the word standard and how it can mean both the flag under which people march and the measure by which work is judged. She did not need a flag. She did need a measure. She needed the day to be shaped by rules that keep good people good and make bad choices hard. She texted a friend a brief line that said they had landed, that they were fed, that all was well enough for now. The reply arrived with a heart and a promise to call later. By late morning, the sun widened, and the announcements on the screens shifted to weather and baggage and connecting gates. The way airports always return to their own cycles after a moment bends them toward human drama. The portal page showed that people had begun to use it. A few early notes were angry in the way that hurt makes anger, but most were simply clear small maps of where respect had been found and where it had not. The company's site posted a simple page titled Peer Standard, with its 4 beams laid out without decoration. There was a form at the bottom that did not require a login, a phone number that would ring to a human during the day and roll gently to a voicemail at night that did not sound like a machine. The training calendar hung on a private page. and someone printed it and taped it by a break room clock at a station in another city. Imani finished her coffee and asked for a refill, which arrived the way refills arrive in places that take pride in never letting a cup go empty. The server smiled at Arya and asked how old she was, and Imani answered in months, and then in the round number that older people prefer. A couple at the next table said the baby had her mother's calm. Imani thanked them and did not explain that calm is a practice, not a trait. She paid the bill, tucked the receipt into her wallet, and placed the folded cash for the tip under the lip of the plate where it would not blow off if the door opened. Her phone buzzed once more. The message was brief. The portal was live. The training would begin this week. The first quarterly summary would be published at the end of the first quarter. A separate note would arrive if she chose to submit a statement. The company remained available if she needed anything else in the meantime. She read it twice, not because she distrusted it, but because she wanted its syllables to anchor a day that had learned the habit of floating. She closed the screen and considered the way change sometimes looks less like a trumpet and more like a door left open for air. She folded her phone and whispered, "I hope this is not just a promise." Outside, late sunlight poured through the diner window, a new day began, and the next flights waited to lift into a fairer sky. In the soft morning after landing coffee steaming in a corner booth, a child sleeping easily the day felt less like a verdict and more like a beginning. The screens promised reform, yet the first proof was simpler. An apology spoken plainly, a room choosing patience, and strangers remembering their manners. This story affirms that love is not loud. A mother's steadiness, a neighbor's apology, and a company deciding to raise its standard are three parts of the same shelter. Atonement is policy plus practice, and the true home is rebuilt by quiet courtesies repeated until the doorway feels safe again. As many have learned over long years, justice turns truth into something livable when we carry it into lines, aisles, and everyday talk like a porch light in winter, small and steady, guiding us through the cold. Take a moment to notice the quiet gifts around you and pass one along. If this touched your heart, let its warmth travel to someone still waiting at the gate.